For more insights, we're joined by Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor at Griffith University. Professor, thank you for making the time to speak with us today. Firstly, what do you make of President Trump's sanctions threats? How could it hurt Russia's war machine?
Well, look, if the sanctions are applied directly between the United States onto to Russia, then it really isn't going to have very much of an impact because an extra 100% on tariffs to Russia. The sum total of trade between the two countries is about $3 billion. So it's not going to have an enormous effect. What would potentially have a significant effect is if these secondary sanctions that Trump has talked about actually go through. And there's a draft bill in front of Congress at the moment that would give the president the authorization to put 500% tariffs on any country that traded with Russia. And of course, you know, some of those countries are countries that the United States would consider friends and wants to deepen relationships with. So I think it remains, you know, an open question whether Trump is prepared to put 500% tariffs on India, for instance, because it has filled a lot of the vacuum in terms of buying up Russian energy that was left by European sanctions. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that question.
Do you think then that this ultimatum can actually push the needle on negotiations for an end to the war? Or is this all just rhetoric?
Well, it's interesting that Trump has given Putin 50 days to seek a peaceful solution. Now, of course, the last phone call they had where Putin told him that he was going to continue the war was 10 days ago, and he said that that was going to go for 60 days. So doing the maths, it really seems as though Putin has his 60 days to prosecute the war before, saying that he'll come back to the negotiating table. Whether he does or not, whether he has that incentive, is going to depend very much, I suppose, on how much territory, if in fact the Russians can capture large amounts of Ukrainian territory, and how serious he thinks Trump is in terms of these secondary sanctions. Look, even partial implementation of those sanctions will have an effect on the Russian economy, and the economy itself isn't doing so well. Inflation is high, interest rates are high, between 20 and 25%. So extra sanctions from the United States through second parties would potentially have an impact.
You mentioned that it also depends on the situation on the battlefield. Russian officials have shrugged off Mr. Trump's warning of more sanctions, saying the U.S. president will likely change his mind in the next 50 days, or, a lot could change on the battlefield in the next 50 days. Do you think Mr. Trump will flip-flop on this, or could we see any major changes on the front lines?
Well, look, I think it's not hugely likely that we'll see enormous changes on the front lines. The Russians have been, gradually moving forward, but very, very slowly. And in some places, they've in fact been pushed back. There are reports that the Russians have, managed to amass a fairly large new force that would be part of the offensive. But so far, Kiev's military has done fairly well. So I don't think necessarily that's going to change enormously. On the question of whether Trump changes his mind, well, we just don't know, because this administration, as we've seen, can change its mind within 60 minutes. So 50 days is a very long time for the Ukrainians to wait to see whether Trump is going to keep his word. So that's why I think the mood in Kiev is, on the one hand, very grateful that Trump has decided to allow European countries to buy American weapon systems and give them to Ukraine. On the other hand, I think they would be quite cautious about the extent to which the US administration will be prepared to follow through.
What's it going to take at this point, do you think, to end the war? President Trump has been saying a deal is near for months now. Realistically, are we anywhere near a deal?
Well, look, from my perspective, I just don't see where the incentive is. Certainly, Trump seems to think that deep down Putin wants peace. But the Russian president really hasn't changed his negotiating position since the start of the conflict. He basically wants, a large portion of Ukraine. He wants Ukraine demilitarized. He wants Ukraine not to be able to join NATO and not to be able to be rearmed either. And that's a really maximalist position. And faced with that, if you're the Ukrainian President Zelensky, you would say, well, effectively what Russia wants to do is turn us into a rump state. And so what is the value of seeking a peace solution beyond perhaps a ceasefire when that's the fate that awaits us? So I think for a lot of the positive talk that's come out of the United States, it seems to me at least that these two sides are still a long way apart.
You mentioned a key point that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be rearmed. Would you consider this new weapons deal for Ukraine that Mr. Trump announced a reversal on his part to support Kyiv militarily? And could that impact negotiations going forward?
Well, there certainly will be a fair bit of domestic debate and discussion about whether what Trump is doing is actively rearming Ukraine or just passively doing so, allowing the Europeans to buy American stocks. I think, frankly, the delivery of things like Patriot missile systems, which you referred to earlier, are absolutely crucial, but they're mainly crucial for defending Ukrainian civilian and critical infrastructure because the Russians have been lobbing up to 740 drones and cruise missiles at residential city targets during the day and during the evening. So being able to resist that is quite significant, but doesn't necessarily help Kiev win or doesn't help Kiev push back the Russians. For that, they're going to, I think, probably need quite a bit more support ongoing from the United States as well as from Europe.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your insights with us. We were speaking to Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor at Griffith University.